thank you for being here. Thank you for asking all of the good questions that you always do. We also had some questions sent in advance, and I'm probably going to uh, intersperse or mix some of those in here as well. But I see there's already a bunch of good questions coming through here. So, um, first question is from Matt Stevens. Hi, Matt. Regarding pulling sap sampling on apple trees, what's the earliest you would recommend getting sap samples? Would you wait until you have enough leaves to do both old and new? Or do you see value in getting samples as soon as the first couple of leaves have reached full size, even though you won't have the new old difference? Yes, Matt, this is an outstanding question. We've even experimented, particularly with more so with cherry production. Also, actually, I think with apples as well. We've experimented just collecting buds and sending buds in for for samples for sap analysis. And I think the way that I would answer that question is that over time, once you have a couple of years of experience with SAP analysis, you should be able to get your year over year agronomy management to a point where you perhaps don't need those very early samples because you kind of know what to expect. You know what the trend line and the trajectory looks like, and you've already addressed some issues that showed up historically. But particularly for the first couple of years, or maybe a better way of saying it would be to say that until you see the issues being resolved in those first couple of samples from the way you managed the prior year, those early samples can be very valuable. And the reason they're so valuable is because the nutritional status of those early leaves also reflects what is happening in the fruit during the cell division period. So that period is obviously extremely important for cherries and for apples and for all of our perennial trees really that are blooming early and then leafing out. So yes, I would highly suggest, even if to start as soon as you have spur leaves that have opened up large enough that you have enough for a single leaf sample, I would begin pulling samples because the information is very valuable from a fruit quality nutrition management perspective. There's a question here, a couple of questions here from Jordan Carlson. Hi, Jordan. Do you know of a good resource to learn from about anion exchange capacity? Trying to remember. It's been years ago that I learned a lot about anion exchange capacity. I think the original reference that I spent some time digging into, if I remember correctly, was William Jackson's book. It's titled Organic Soil Conditioning, Humic, Fulvic, and Microbial Balance. It's you have to go digging online to find it. There has been William Jackson's. I'm not sure who manages the website from the company that he started. It might be his family at this point. He passed away a couple of years ago. I don't think the book is readily available on Amazon, or if it is, it's very overpriced. You can get it for, you used to be able to get it for under $100 from his direct website. And so the book again is Organic Soil Conditioning, Humic, Fulvic, and Microbial Balance. And it's a doorstopper of a scientific reference book. And I think there are other resources as well, but I can't think of which ones they would be right now. Might also just look online on Google Scholar and see what you can find there. All right. There's a question here about foliar applications of urea. Can you use magnesium sulfate instead of ammonium thiosulfate in the mixture to add sulfur? Yes, you can, particularly. In fact, if you're doing this as a foliar, so our common recommendation is for the use of thiosulfate as a sidedress application. If you're using it as a foliar, I would prefer the use of a sulfate form rather than a thiosulfate form. And some thiosulfates like calcium and potassium thiosulfate can also be very valuable as a foliar, but they can also easily become very hot. They have a very high electrical conductivity, and you can easily cross the threshold and cause some plant burn. And so magnesium sulfate and other sulfates tend to be a lot kinder to the plant foliage and are not quite as hot. So that would be my preference. All right, so I'm going to switch to some of the other questions that have come through here. There's a question here from Brandon I'm curious what John recommends to improve selenium in food products and in my land. I may be missing something obvious, but I didn't see AEA products with selenium listed. Should I be looking at soil or foliar applications? As another approach, I also rotationally graze various livestock, so I'm curious in the value of supplementing the livestock to slowly improve selenium in the land. I hear of selenium being discussed frequently with sheep, so my assumption is that they have a higher selenium requirement and may be used as a tool to improve the land if grazed with selenium supplementation. All right, so this is a big question and one that I'm actually going to talk about selenium for just a little bit because I think there are some ways in agriculture that we are really, really missing the boat by a mile, and selenium is one of them. The context, quickly, is we know that we have this epidemic of cancer in our human population. Half the people living today are expected to get cancer in their lifetime. And why would we expect that to be normal? And I haven't done this homework myself. I should go digging, but good friends of mine have told me that if you do a thorough literature review, there are over 400 peer-reviewed published papers in the literature describing selenium as an effective prevention and as an effective treatment for all types of different cancers. So if that's true, then why would we not prioritize biofortifying our foods and making sure that we have generous selenium levels across our entire food chain? How beneficial and how valuable would that be from a human health perspective, uh, and just from an overall value of life perspective? This seems like such an obvious piece that we should be prioritizing. And we well know and well understand, we have an abundance of data to describe that many of our soils, majority of our soils, there are exceptions in low rainfall, low arid areas. Like you have the soil maps exist of what the selenium status is of our soils. You can easily find that information. We have the areas where the majority of our food is grown, most of our food is grown in selenium deficient soils, particularly here in the eastern half of the United States in our high rainfall environment. We have lost the selenium in our soils over decades and centuries of weathering and erosion. And so addressing selenium, we know that our human population and our livestock are chronically deficient in selenium. And so in the case of livestock management, to the question that Brandon asked, there has been this historical dogma, this historical approach within the livestock grazing space that one of the foundational pathways to be profitable in beef production in particular is not to spend money on inputs for the land specifically. And I think, and then at the same time, we turn around and we free choice feed expensive kelp to livestock to supply them with enough selenium and iodine. Or we feed, in the case of dairy cattle, we feed selenium yeast or selenomethionine. Those livestock supplementation sources of providing selenium in the diet are much more expensive than it would be to address selenium in our soils. So from a human health perspective, this is something I've thought about this for a long time, but there have always been other priorities, and this never made it to the top of the priority list of the top 10 things that I wanted to work on. And that has recently shifted. So this is something that is very important. It is something that we're going to be working on here at AEA, is providing a selenium product that can be applied, that is affordable to serve as a soil remediation or as a crop remediation. And so it is, my perspective is it's much less expensive to address selenium in soils and plants than it is to feed it to livestock or to constantly supplement. Like I take selenium supplements of selenomethionine every day, at least 200 to 400 micrograms, and occasionally much more than that if I sense a viral or bacterial infection coming, up to 1 milligram per day. And so I suppose the concluding point to Brandon's first question is that as of this moment, there is not an AEA rebound selenium product. I expect that to change at some point in the future, and it will be interesting to navigate the situation of having a product that is very effective and is affordable and is also organically compliant. Because and that's one of the reasons why a Selenium product doesn't exist right now, is because when I last looked at it a number of years ago, the soil amendment sources that are most effective, the most effective one is sodium selenate, which is not readily available in the marketplace, or at least wasn't at the time. That is a different oxidation state. That's NaSeO4. The most commonly and readily available ingredient back at that point was sodium selenite, which is NaSeO3. And selenite also works, but not as effectively as selenate. And the challenge is that back in the day, when I looked at it, if I remember correctly, neither of those materials were organically certifiable or organically susceptible, which was a much larger proportion of our customer base back at one point than it is at the moment. So we will be working on developing an organically compliant rebound selenium. And I think I'm readily giving away information here, but the reason I'm doing so is because all of you can also, if you do a little bit of digging, you can easily figure out everything on your own that I've already talked about. But I think there's a lot of value in having a rebound selenium, only because the quantity that is needed per acre is so comparatively small, measured in grams or ounces per acre, that this is not something you broadcast as a dry ingredient, not even with a drone. This is something that, in order to get good distribution and get good soil coverage, we need to turn it into a liquid and spray it onto the plants as a foliar application, spray it onto the soil. So that's the only type of application that really makes sense logistically in order to get good and uniform distribution. So, all right. It's a very good question, Brandon. You can expect to see a Selenium product for agriculture on the marketplace that we'll be putting on the marketplace at some point. And I'm sure other people have some that are out there right now as well, but many of them that I see are not. I don't see anything that is chelated or that is particularly designed to be exceptionally effective. They're just raw material ingredients. Question here from Kurt. In organic winter wheat, will an amino acid nitrogen foliar at flag leaf be the best way to increase our protein an extra point or two? What have semi-arid wheat growers working with AEA been able to do for raising high quality wheat? We have a lot of experience in dryland wheat production, Kurt. And so there are different things that we've been doing, but the short version is that yes, an amino acid nitrogen source can be beneficial. The question that I would ask is a nitrogen deficiency is that the actual source of low protein? Is that the actual reason why you have low protein and lower yields? So we all know that the correlation between nitrogen content and protein content is imperfect and imprecise. In fact, mostly when we measure wheat, we're actually not measuring protein content, we're just measuring nitrogen content. But the amount of nitrogen that can be held inside the kernel and can be converted to protein is not a reflection of the amount of nitrogen that's provided to the plant, so much as it is a reflection of the sulfur and magnesium and molybdenum levels. Those are the elements that are needed to form complete proteins. So if you want to elevate protein levels, a foliar application at that stage should not just contain amino acids. You also have to address those other elements. And in fact, if I were to say it differently, I would say, unless your crop is nitrogen deficient, which few wheat crops are, but if your wheat crop has reasonable levels of nitrogen, you can actually increase the protein content of the grain quite significantly with foliar applications of magnesium and sulfur molybdenum that don't include nitrogen. You don't have to include nitrogen in the foliar spray because that isn't the limiting factor most of the time. It can be the limiting factor, but in many cases it's not. So that's the way I would answer that question. Two questions here from Chris. Hi, Chris. Your musing on what a plant would look like if it could express its full genetic potential has spurred me to experiment. I believe there is potential by following single plant cultivation techniques introduced by Fukuoka in the One Straw Revolution, formalized in the system of rice intensification, expanded to other cereal crops by Cornell in the system of crop intensification. Um, by moving up the plant nutrition pyramid, I believe wheat growers can disregard the Hessian fly threat and plant 2 to 3 months earlier. I can confirm that that is absolutely true and absolutely the case, particularly when you start addressing boron. And plant 2 to 3 months earlier to encourage maximum tiller development prior to winter dormancy. The hypothesis is equal or greater yield of nutrient-dense grain from 1/10 of plant population. I would very much value your comments. Uh, Chris, the short answer is yes. I'm generally conceptually in alignment that I think this is an area that is underexplored and underdeveloped, largely because of weed control and managing weeds in a commercial setting and just the way our crop rotation systems are commonly set up. There are a couple of folks who are doing some innovative stuff in this space, both here in North America and internationally. One in particular that I'd point out is Frederick Larson, who is a farmer and agronomist from Denmark. I interviewed him recently on the podcast, and um, I primarily see his posts on social media on X or Twitter. I don't know if he's also active on those other social media platforms or not, but he is definitely worth following and paying attention to the work that he is doing, because he is going in the direction of figuring out the crop rotations, the intercropping with earlier planting on small grains based on these ideas, and is figuring out how to implement them and execute them successfully on a commercial scale. To your second question, Dr. Albrecht wrote that calcium is the premier element. Please explain the difficulties a wheat plant has through its vegetative and fruiting cycles to move calcium from the soil colloid complex to the maturing kernel. How do the two AEA calcium products help eliminate calcium deficiency and improve plant health? All right. So, Chris, this is a good question, one that I could talk about for 20 minutes, but the way that I would say it is that calcium is the fulcrum. It's the leverage point against which you leverage everything else. So if you have adequate levels of calcium, all of a sudden, this is a common phenomenon, one that I've observed, I don't know, hundreds of times at this point. A grower might be using a foliar application of a trace mineral product, let's say zinc and manganese, and puts on a foliar application, runs a sap analysis before and after, and yeah, if it is a good product like our Rebound zinc and manganese products, the needle moves, but it doesn't move as much as you would expect it to move, given that he applied 4 quarts of product, or a very high product application rate. And that phenomena occurs over and over again in low calcium settings. And then all of a sudden you address calcium levels come up. All of a sudden you put on a foliar application of a pint of product and of a zinc or manganese, and you get more movement on the needle. The sap analysis levels move more rapidly with a pint of product than they previously did with 4 quarts. It's a very common phenomenon. You get much greater crop responses to anything that you apply when you have a foundation of generous calcium levels to leverage against. So that's the way that I think about, that's how foundational and how important adequate levels of bioavailable calcium are. So ultimately, from a long-term sustainability perspective, the objective is to build levels of available calcium in the soil and to have good biological activity in the soil through the rhizophagy cycle, and to have generous boron levels in the soil. And when we have those 3 things, that should address calcium so that we're not dependent on foliar applications of calcium. So our HoloCal product and our MacroPack product are very effective in irrigation systems and in planter applications and in foliar applications at moving the needle and getting calcium up into the plants, into the crops very quickly. But I think of them as a Band-Aid. They're there to fix the problem if we didn't succeed in having good enough biological activity to deliver calcium from the soil in the first place. That's the ultimate long-term solution. So HoloCal and MacroPack are there to fix temporary problems in the current growing season if our foundation isn't yet in place. And they work very effectively either as foliar applications or almost any type of application system to solve that. All right, let me switch back to see what other questions have come in here. What are some of the best modes of action in herbicides that are least detrimental to soils and can control weeds to a relatively high level? I do not know the answer to that question. And of all the things that I could study in the world that I want to learn more about, pesticides, modes of action, and effectiveness is not on the list. So, as an organization, as a company, um, we aspire to be the leaders and to provide the very best agronomic management information, nutrition management information. We do not pay attention to fungicides and insecticides and pesticides. There are many other people out there who spend the majority of their time thinking about those things, and we defer to the experts on that. That is not our area of expertise, and nor do I have any desire for that to be our area of expertise. Follow-up question, what are some key applications to improve test weight for wheat? And the answer is, as with so many things agronomically, you have to address foundational aspects. You have to have adequate levels of calcium and potassium and so forth. But assuming you have addressed the foundational pieces, the mineral elements that have the most direct contributing effect to increasing test weight are the trace minerals, particularly the trace mineral metals and boron. So zinc, manganese, copper, boron, even cobalt applications. A foliar application of those elements in the last post-flag leaf or even in the dough stage, or the milk. Actually, let me take that back. Not in the dough stage, but in the milk stage. You need to be slightly earlier in the dough stage for the greatest effect. But foliar applications of those trace elements as you're approaching the grain fill period are going to have the most direct benefit on increasing test weight. As long as the foundational elements are in place, you still have to have that foundation to work from. All right. Next question is here from Alex. Here in Northeast Indiana, we have heavy clay soils and deal with slug pressure in the spring when soils are cool and wet. You've said before that high iron content in seedlings can be toxic or act as a deterrent to slugs. Is it possible to get the iron content of the seedling high enough for this to be effective with a seed-applied fertilizer? Or would it be necessary to add some type of in-furrow product to supplement? Also open to any other suggestions to help deal with slug issues. Alex, it's a good question. It's really a question of timing and speed of product absorption. So the way that we've formulated our seed flare, and we are continuing to refine that formulation, it will include an iron component here at some point in the near future. And what is unique about seed flare is that all the minerals that it contains actually are absorbed by the seed. They're not on the seed coating, but they're actually inside the seed, and therefore they end up inside the plant right from the beginning. And so a product like that would have the greatest likelihood of success because even if you just have a seed treatment that is a seed coating or an in-furrow application, those are things that are very worthwhile experimenting with, and I would expect to have some level of response. You still have a short window of susceptibility until those products are absorbed. How rapidly can that absorption happen? We know the root radical emerges before we have leaf emergence, but sometimes it's a period of just a day or two difference between root radical emergence and seedling emergence. And if there isn't enough time, it's really a question of timing. How rapidly can you get iron either into the seed or into that seedling to give it that resistance? So I would actually experiment if this is a particular objective of yours. As we work with the seed flare formulation, reach out to us. I'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation to dig deeply into and perhaps to run some trials on exactly what can we do as a seed treatment to have the most immediate and the greatest effect possible, because I think this is something that's very worthwhile figuring out. Next question. Also, a follow-up question from Alex. It is also common in wet springs on our clay soils to deal with heavy pressure from seedling diseases like Pythium and Phytophthora. There's a lot of fear-mongering from seed companies about the necessity of using a fungicide seed treatment. What are some alternative management practices I could use to help mitigate the risk of seedling diseases in soybeans, especially? All right, Alex, this is a good question, and you have to develop some personal experience and some personal comfort with the answer here. In our experience, let me see. You said Pythium and Phytophthora. Depending on the soil, depending on the context, sometimes Phytophthora can be slightly more difficult, or shouldn't say more difficult, but there's a longer window of time needed to control Phytophthora with a probiotic instead of an antibiotic approach. In other words, the approach of using inoculants instead of fungicides. So Phytophthora occasionally, depending on the context, can take a week to 2 weeks. Pythium responds like the snap of a finger. It's possible to shut Pythium down with microbial inoculants very effectively. So I have a couple of thoughts. One is you need to experiment with the use of BioCoat Gold, because I would expect the BioCoat Gold to change the microbiome around that seedling significantly enough that your Pythium and Phytophthora pressure is largely going to disappear, just because those other organisms are going to outcompete them. This is a very common response that growers see. But the other thought that I have is, in a greenhouse setting where we were dealing with damping off of seedlings, we used to have this approach. This was when I was still growing up on the farm at home, and before we had any of the AEA products. We had much less high quality liquid products available in the marketplace at that point 15, 20 years ago than we do today. In a greenhouse setting where we're growing vegetable seedlings in trays in a greenhouse, our approach to damping off, so damping off is Pythium, our approach to solving damping off was to put on a foliar application of a light dosage of sugar. And you could stop damping off like flipping a switch with a small application of sugar. Why? Because the sugar application did two things. One, it changed the sugar and the energy levels of the seedlings. They had higher sugar content, but more importantly, the secondary effect of that is that light dosage of sugar stimulated other microbes, and those other microbes suppressed Pythium and prevented Pythium from becoming a problem and causing damping off. So, and I've shared this story in the past. I've received dozens of feedback points from other growers who've told me that they tried a similar solution. They tried that idea and found it to be perfectly successful. I don't know that it's ever failed. So the other thing that is worth trying is in a planter solution, when you're planting and you're putting nutrients on the seed or in close proximity to the seed, also, also add rejuvenate. This is the perfect opportunity to add rejuvenate. With the carbohydrate component that it contains, I would expect to see Pythium being shut down very quickly and very effectively. So these are things that you need to experiment with in your particular context, because soil microbiomes are so different and soil context is so different. What works very well for you may not work 100 miles away, or may not work even 10 miles away. So experiment with it, develop your own comfort level with it. But I'm more than a little optimistic that, well, let me say that differently. I am certain that you can control both Pythium and Phytophthora simply by enhancing the rest of the microbiome in greater than 90% of soil situations. There are some soil contexts that are extremely pro-pathogenic and disease enhancing that are challenging, but they're a tiny minority. Question here from Tim. When making the shift to regenerative agriculture, we engage with life's fundamental processes and the unfathomably complex biological networks that sustain plant life. Beyond sap analysis, microbiology, and other scientific approaches that can guide us, what is the role, if any, of intuition, spirituality, and our internal alignment with the natural world? Can you speak to your personal perspective? My goodness, Tim, if I would have read that question in advance, I may not have brought it up here in such a public setting or context. Um, so the I actually addressed or talked about some of this um, in a short podcast episode, roughly 8 or 9 months ago, where I shared parts of a chapter of one of Stephen Herod Buhner's books. I think the book that I borrowed a chapter or part of a chapter from was his book on plant intelligence. And the um, I can just answer your question very succinctly by saying that intuition and or spiritual connection, whatever language you chose to use, we understand that good husbandry and good stewardship is is foundationally built on having a strong connection, particularly in the case of livestock management. So anyone who has spent any appreciable amount of time around livestock producers, I've experienced encountered this phenomenon many times when you walk into or you walk through a herd of cows with a dairy farmer, and they will say something like, there is something off about that cow. And there is nothing visual that they can point to. In many cases, sometimes there is, but in many cases, there is nothing that they can point to that they can explain how they know that or why they know. They just know that something is off. And the same phenomena occurs with very good farm managers. When we walk through a field or we walk through a block of trees in an orchard, and growers will say like, something is off with this block. Something just doesn't feel right. And in many cases, when we are working with our intuition, that's the best that we can do. That's the best that we can communicate, is to say that's just something doesn't feel right. But it's that intuitive feeling of recognizing that something is right that then gives us the inspiration to go digging and to try to discover and understand what isn't right, and also to follow our intuition. In many cases, when I say go digging and start trying to uncover, it might be with using sap analysis or soil analysis or microbiome analysis, all types of different analytical tools. Many times it's remarkable to me, we have this broad array. When I talk about going digging, you could start going down 50 different earthworm holes to try to understand what's going on. But usually we don't have to go down 50 earthworm holes. Of all the possible various choices, we end up going down an earthworm hole that starts bringing us answers, usually fairly quickly, when the first, second, or third try. And when you think about being able to come up with some type of answer in a few tries and after a relatively small amount of digging, when you have dozens of possible directions that you could have gone, there's an argument to be made that we are also being led by our intuition in where to start looking. Where do we start looking for possible solutions? So my short answer is that I believe, after having worked with many extremely intelligent and smart, high IQ farmers and farm managers, the best farm managers pay attention to their intuition about what's happening and what's going on. It's not just an intellectual exercise. There is also this very strong intuitive stewardship and connection component. All right. So let me see. Quite a few other questions that have come through here. There is one from Weston. What is the best way to control nematodes in a crop? They can do a lot of damage in our area. So Weston, let me say it this way. It is absolutely 100% possible to control nematodes with biological, or with, I would say, with agronomic management practices. And in my experience, there isn't a single answer, but it is kind of a multifaceted answer. The different components are, one is you have to address the carbon to nitrogen ratio in your soil. Usually that ratio ends up being way too narrow. You don't have enough carbon to buffer out all the nitrogen that's in the system. That's one aspect. The second aspect is that often you don't have enough of the elements that are needed to form complete proteins in the bacterial cells in the soil relative to the amount of nitrogen that's present. So you need to address magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and boron. The next component, and by the way, molybdenum and boron, well, they're all important, but molybdenum and boron are particularly important in that quad of 4 nutrients that I mentioned. And then, of course, there are other things that you can do, such as using a mustard cover crop or using other particular types of cover crops, using specific microbial inoculants of pathogenic, not pathogenic, but of nematode fighting fungi. There are specific fungal inoculants that will go after nematodes. So there are some of those things that you can do. But what is interesting about the use of mustard and the use of microbial inoculants, they can be very effective for a period of time, a year, 2 years, 5 years, sometimes with repeat applications. But repeat applications will continue to be needed until you address the foundational issues of the carbon and nitrogen imbalance. You address those foundational pieces, and the nematode pressure reduces and subsides to the point where it's not an economic threshold. It's no longer something that's even of concern, and it stays that way for the long term. And actually, I'll mention one other exasperating issue that can be that can add a layer of complexity to the situation is not just carbon and nitrogen ratios, but also high levels of salts in the soil, particularly sodium and chloride, tend to make nematode issues worse. And remediating those also will speed up the resolution. And that obvious question is, well, how do you remediate them? And from a macro perspective, the answer is, again, narrowing up the carbon and nitrogen ratio and addressing carbon. Getting more carbon into our soils will help to buffer out a lot of the high salts. So there's a lot more detail. There's also one of the things that I missed talking about is doing diverse cover crop species. So when you have, there are things that happen when you have a diversity of cover crops that do not occur with just a single cover crop species on its own. Just recently, I was having a conversation with a grower that we work with in California who, after several years of using a diverse blend with, if I remember correctly, he was using 12 different cover crop species in his diverse mix. And after 2 years, 2 successive cover crops over a 2-year period, this was in addition to the cash crop production, their sodium and chloride levels dropped in their soils by over 60%. Nothing changed with irrigation water quality. Irrigation water management was essentially the same, but the contribution of those cover crop mixes resulted in greatly reducing soil salinity, which then had a follow-on effect of reducing nematode pressure, or would have in many situations. So that's the longer macro answer to nematode management. All right, let me see. We have a question here from John Rosani. Hi, John. As a mixed organic vegetable grower who utilizes tillage for seedbed preparation, cultivation, and stale seed bedding, what would be a few small steps that I could make that would bring back and maintain good soil aggregation? I do use cover crops extensively, while cash crops are not occupying the fields, as well as sap testing to address deficiencies and excesses in the plants. What is the best way to get involved in consulting work? I've been growing vegetables nearly 20 years and would really enjoy helping others on their journey to grow food in a regenerative manner. So, John, to your first question, how can you maintain good soil aggregation? And I had the privilege of teaching a day-long class yesterday in Pennsylvania to a group of almost 300 farmers. Most of them were fruit and vegetable growers, or probably 60% were fruit and vegetable growers, in collaboration with Bob Jones Jr. from Chef's Garden. And um, I need to get Bob back on the podcast to talk about what he is doing and the work that they are doing. But in short, the short answer to your question is it's challenging in the ecosystem context, but I'm going to answer it this way. Um, the most effective way to build soil aggregates is to have diverse cover crop species that are photosynthesizing and pumping sugar into the soil for as much of the photosynthetic season as possible, from early spring until late summer. Is you want green photosynthesizing plants for the longest period possible. That's the foundation of how you build aggregates quickly. And there are a few individual cover crops that do this reasonably well on their own. Hairy vetch is one, buckwheat is one, oats are one. But in general, you get much greater effects and compounding effects when you have a diversity of species rather than just a couple of species. They do not behave the same. They do not produce the same soil responses. In other words, a cover crop is not a cover crop is not a cover crop. They behave differently when they are in combinations than when they are alone or in small groups. So that's how you build it. Now, the other question that's worth thinking and asking about is, how do you destroy soil aggregates? At present, my current understanding is that there are 4 principal ways that you can rapidly destroy soil aggregation. One of them is simply by compacting them with too heavy equipment moving across the surface. So just simple, straightforward compaction will destroy soil aggregation. The second method of destroying soil aggregation is by narrowing up the carbon to nitrogen ratio and having too much nitrogen in the soil system. And this can come from all kinds of places. It can come from applied nitrogen fertilizer. It can come from legumes. If you have a system that is dominated by legumes, have you ever stopped to think about how incredibly compacted soils are after soybean production and after alfalfa production? Some of the most compacted soils that I've observed. And it's not because, in the case of alfalfa production, it's not just because of the harvesting traffic. It's also because of all the nitrogen that is produced from the nodules that produces a narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio and destroys soil aggregation. Legumes can destroy soil aggregation as effectively as nitrogen fertilizer, and they do so all the time. The third way of destroying aggregation is to over-till soils, to till them too deep. There's some fascinating research by Margaret Sakara, who is an Austrian soil scientist. She wrote a fascinating little book titled Healthy Soils, 6 Soils, that I added to my recommended reading list that you can find on my blog post. And there were some interesting highlights to Margaret Sakara's work. One of them is she said that in her research, she observed that there was no destruction, no long-term destruction of soil aggregation from a tillage event, as long as 2 things happened. As long as the tillage was not deeper than the zone of stable soil aggregation, and as long as following tillage, the soil was immediately reseeded and you had living root systems and small seedlings that were transferring sugars down into the soil profile. So as long as those 2 requirements were met, she did not see tillage being destructive of soil aggregate structure. And I think I would expect that there are probably a few outliers to that. You can certainly over-till a soil with a rototiller and just beat it to death, for example. So that would be an outlier. But in general, tillage is not inherently destructive of soil aggregate stability, as long as you manage what happens before and after, or during and after. The fourth way of destroying soil aggregates is simply by leaving them exposed to the sun. You have bare soil exposed to the sun for extended periods, and that will destroy the glomalin and the glue that holds soil aggregates together. And then I missed there's a 5th pathway to destroying soil aggregates, and that is to simply not have um, to not have living plant roots transmitting sugars into the soil to sustain the soil microbial population, because it's the microbial population, the fungi in particular, but also the microbes that support them, that build the glomalin, that build the glue that holds soil aggregates together. And in Margaret Sakara's work, she described that if soils did not have living plant roots transmitting appreciable quantities, some significant quantities of sugars out through the root exudates for a period of 9 months, that would lead to the destruction of stable soil aggregates. Now you think about what that means. A period of 9 months, if it includes the dormant season, means that you have a 3-month growing window. So if you only have plants photosynthesizing in reasonable amounts, transmitting sugars to the soil for a 3-month period, that means that's going to lead to the destruction of stable soil aggregates over time. And that's the exact scenario that we have in most agricultural soils today. If you're growing a corn crop or a soybean crop, or even most cotton crops are slightly longer season. But if you think about a corn crop, if you have a 110-day corn crop, there's not going to be significant sugar contribution to the soil microbiome for the first 20 to 30 days and for the last 20 days. So now you've taken a 110-day crop in terms of its sugar contribution to the soil down to an 80-day crop, or perhaps even a 70-day crop. All of a sudden, that means you have 10 months. Unless you're growing a cover crop or an intercrop, you're doing something else. If you are only growing a cash crop during the summer months, that means your soils will lose aggregate stability, and they will compact over time, simply because there's not enough sugar flow going into the soil to feed soil biology over the course of the entire year. You only have 2 months out of 12 months where you're getting significant sugar supply. All right. So other questions. There's a question here from Kurt. We use we use a nitrin-pyrin product in our early spring dry urea applications to slow conversion to nitrate. I've often wished we could use a product like Humicarb in its place. Are they equivalent? Are there any plans to have a dry liquid humic product that would work with urea? We use Humicarb with our UAN and KTS applications now. It would be great to get away from this chemistry being added to our soils. Glad you're thinking this way, Kurt, because I very strongly agree with you. I think the ingredient that you're adding is essentially, as you very well know and understand, it is there to shut down microbes and microbial processes, which is the exact opposite of what you want to have happen. We've had growers experiment with Humicarb applications in dry urea. It can be done at small application rates, but you have to be very careful with it because it also can easily facilitate setting up everything. You're looking at fairly small doses of a couple quarts per ton, if I remember correctly. And there are dry humic acid powders that you could also experiment with. But there is another approach that you can take, and that's to go in the opposite direction. So humic substances are stabilizing agents that are relatively effective. But there's another stabilizing process, which is to rapidly incorporate the urea into bacterial cells. And so rather than shutting down biology, what you actually do is you speed up biology. You speed up the biological process. And so the nitrification process that you're concerned about, you can bypass that nitrification process and have it structured, have a microbial process that actually holds the nitrogen stable in the soil profile in the form of bacterial cells and bacterial proteins. So to accomplish that, you need a soluble carbohydrate source. This is where we would use a product like Rejuvenate. Make sure you have adequate levels of sulfur. And actually, I'll mention this. There's a rule of thumb that we've used for a long time, and I realized recently I haven't talked about it enough. I think this rule of thumb, where I first heard about it 20 years ago, was from Gary Zimmer at Midwestern BioAg, but I've since heard it from many other places as well. I'm not sure where it originally originates. The rule of thumb is that the first 25 pounds of sulfur will replace 25 pounds of nitrogen with no effect on crop yield, no negative effect on crop yield and performance. It might even be a positive effect. And in fact, I do see a positive effect on small grains, particularly on wheat. And sometimes On some crops, I have a sneaking suspicion that the number is higher than 25 pounds. I suspect on some of the wheat production data that I've seen that the number might be as high as 35 to 40 pounds of sulfur can replace the first 35 to 40 pounds of nitrogen. But I don't have, I'm not saying that that is the case right now because I need to do more data analysis to verify that first. But what this means, when you think about this, if the first 25 pounds of sulfur can replace 25 pounds of nitrogen, that means you can use 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate to replace 100 pounds of urea and get the exact same crop response. And we've observed that, documented that. That's very well understood to be the case. There's not a lot of controversy around that. So that sulfur contribution does more than just provide a nice crop response. It also provides the sulfur that the soil biology needs to slow down the denitrification process, or a better way of saying it is to get that nitrogen bound up in microbial proteins in the soil profile. So that could be one possible, relatively easy, straightforward mix. Instead of just applying straight urea, you apply a blend of ammonium sulfate and urea, and perhaps put some dry humic substances with it, possibly spray the soil with rejuvenate or something like that in a similar time frame, about the same time. And you're taking a probiotic approach instead of an antibiotic approach, and you're holding that nitrogen stable in the soil microbial profile. So this is essentially a dry version of what you were already doing in liquid with our nitrogen efficiency program, nitrogen stabilization. You're doing the same thing in the dry setting as you would be doing in the liquid. There's a question here from Davis. Hi, Davis. I own a nursery and grow trees in the field, which are then harvested for sale to the landscape industry. For years, we used glyphosate in the rows to deal with weeds. I no longer use glyphosate, and instead of, at the recommendation of AEA, I'm using clethodim sparingly to deal with grass in the rows. I'm also attempting to put some of Christine Jones' ideas to work by seeding some lower growing native forbs into my tree rows. However, I still have some issues with broadleaf weeds in some areas that probably need to be dealt with an herbicide. My questions are, can you recommend an herbicide that is effective on broadleaf weeds? And how detrimental do you think weed competition actually is? So to your first question, I am not an expert on various herbicide mechanisms, modes of actions, what is more or less harmful, and I have no desire of becoming an expert. So I don't have a qualified opinion to answer that question. There are people on our team who do have more qualified opinions, and lots of people outside AEA who also have a qualified perspective, but I'm not on that list. Secondly, to your second question, how detrimental do you think weed competition actually is? This is an awesome question, Davis. Thank you for asking this, because this is the perfect question, because I'll answer it this way. One is, it depends on the plant and the weed, obviously. Some are more competitive than others. But what I observe generally, and as I'm learning more about quorum sensing and plant communities and how plant communities interact with each other, my understanding right now is that when you have a diversity of plant species in a biologically active soil, those are the two key, the foundational things that are needed. When you have a diversity of plant species from 8 or more different plant families, so it's not just species, but it's from 8 or more different plant families, supported by a healthy soil microbiome, that entire ecosystem, plants and microbes, begins behaving in this quorum sensing collaborative manner as a single superorganism, and they begin collaborating instead of competing. So this idea that plants are inherently competing with each other, it's true, it happens, only environments where soils are dead or where there are a few species. So where you only have a limited number of species and you have a limited microbiome, it is absolutely true that plants do compete with each other for water and nutrients. But when you have a diverse ecosystem and an abundant soil microbiome, then that rule, as my understanding is today, that rule goes out the window. Plants no longer compete with each other. Instead, they begin collaborating with each other. They begin sharing water and they begin sharing nutrients. And in that type of an ecosystem, I think your quote unquote weed competition becomes no competition. There's no competition there anymore. Instead, it is collaboration. And there are many growers in many different crop settings and contexts who have observed this to be true. So I think there's an awesome opportunity for you to experiment and to evaluate and to see if you can establish the required crop diversity and microbiome strength to convert potential competitors to collaborators. Question from Dennis McLaughlin. Research shows, Dr. Christine Jones, that putting a biostimulant on seed is a good thing, but combining a biostimulant plus trace elements on a seed is not a good idea. You don't get the rhizosheath development you get with just a biostimulant. Would seed flare qualify as trace elements? Two thoughts here. One is yes, seed flare qualifies as a trace element. And the reason that mineral seed treatments and biological seed treatments on the seed surface don't work well together is that many of the trace mineral elements, when they are in concentrated form, such as concentrated boron or concentrated copper sulfate, etc., if they are on the seed surface, then those concentrated minerals actually serve as a biocide. I mean, after all, if you have highly concentrated copper or boron in a spray tank, it will shut down compost teas or microbial inoculants that you add with it as well. So that's a very well-known phenomenon. Christine Jones is absolutely correct in that. However, this thought process does not hold true for seed flare. Why not? Well, because for the very simple reason that seed flare is not on the seed surface. Seed flare is specifically designed because of this interaction. I specifically designed seed flare to be absorbed by the seed and to be inside the seed, not on the seed surface. And that's why we actually see this very powerful synergistic effect from using both seed flare and BioCoat Gold. So first you put on the application of seed flare, and we have a lot of people, it's a very common application anymore to even add seed flare and BioCoat Gold in a very short time frame within a matter of a few minutes to each other in the same seed treatment hopper. And we do not find it to be detrimental because actually there's another reason that I missed. The nutrients that are contained in seed flare are not ionic copper sulfate. They're not concentrated copper sulfate and boron, etc. Instead, they are chelated with organic acids and amino acids, which facilitates their absorption into the seed. And it also means that they don't have the direct negative detrimental effect on soil microbes, so or on seed treatment microbes. So the combination of those two things, we're now, what is it, a year? We just released seed flare roughly a year ago, but in the last year we have had quite a fair amount of field experience on a broad array of different crops and different seeds, and without question there is a compounding synergistic positive effect in using both seed flare and BioCoat Gold at the same time. So the evidence suggests that this is different from putting mineral seed treatments on the seed surface. Dennis, second question, could you explain why more is not better when using a biostimulant? Well, biostimulant is a very broad category with thousands of different compounds that are now being used and being called as biostimulants in very many different types of categories. But many of these compounds, the effect that they produce in plants, if you think about it from a phytohormone perspective, their effectiveness is concentration dependent. And just the same as within mammalian bodies, if our hormone systems were disrupted and if a phytohormone is effective at a certain concentration of, I'm making it up here, 100 parts per million, bumping the concentration to 1,000 parts per million or 10xing it does not add additional value. Usually it has a very detrimental effect. And the same concept is true in plants as well. These phytonutrient compounds, phytohormones, and so forth, there's an optimal threshold, and when you cross that optimal threshold, you start having negative effects. And the band that defines the optimal threshold is perhaps a lot narrower, or it's perhaps unknown. So there's a great deal that is yet unknown about the use of a lot of of various plant biostimulants. Dennis, next question. When using a liquid biostimulant and BioCoat Gold to inoculate seed, is it okay to mix the two before applying? Or is it important to dampen the seed first with the liquid and then add the BioCoat Gold, and why? So I'm missing a bunch of context here, but I'll say it this way. Microbial inoculants tend to come alive when they're exposed to a lot of free water, to a lot of free moisture. So if you add a liquid biostimulant to a seed first, and then you add BioCoat Gold, what usually happens is, and this is a very common application process, what usually happens is the seed becomes sticky, the BioCoat Gold sticks, but then that seed tends to dry off unless you're applying large amounts of liquid, but that seed tends to dry out. It'll absorb the liquid within a period of, it can be a few hours to at most 24 hours. And if when that dries out quickly enough, that will not continue to provide an environment for the biology to come alive. If you mix BioCoat Gold in a liquid solution and you have surrounded by free water, then it's going to start coming alive when it would be best for it to not come alive unless you're going to be doing an application, getting it out into the field shortly after that. So my general preference would be to add liquid to the seed first, followed by BioCoat Gold, and not to combine them on application. All right, moving on. There's a couple of other questions here. Oh my goodness, where did that hour go? That was fast. Question from JC McLennan. How do you manage nutrient demand with foliar timing where bloom and pod development can happen at the same time, knowing the demands are different for each critical point of influence? This is an awesome question. So for those of you who are hearing about this for the first time, the context here is we know that during the cell division period, for many crops, this is 10 to 14 days following the pollination of a blossom. At that window, we have very high calcium requirements for the developing embryo. And after that cell division window closes, the highest requirement is for potassium. And the challenge is that calcium and potassium have an antagonistic relationship with each other and don't tend to not play kindly. If you have high potassium levels, you end up not getting good calcium levels moving into the embryos. So now what do you do when you have a plant that has a continuous blossoming and flowering period and you have both developing fruit or seeds and blossoms at the plant at the same time? It's a great question. The answer is you provide the plant with generous amounts of the nutrients that it needs to self-regulate. So plants will self-regulate potassium when they have adequate levels of manganese. Manganese behaves as the potassium thermostat, and it allows the plant to regulate how potassium is moved around and where it goes in the plant. And the same is true of calcium and boron levels. The plant has a much greater ability to self-regulate, to homeostatically manage its calcium supply in different organs of the plant when it has generous levels of boron. So the answer is, if you have a plant like a tomato crop or a soybean crop or a pea crop where you have an extended bloom period, ensuring that those plants have generous levels of manganese and boron allows you to produce the highest quality blossoms and fruit embryos, seed embryos during the cell division period, and also to continue to size and fill those seeds that are more mature. It's a great question. Next question, why isn't nickel talked about and should we test for it? Well, nickel is not talked about because historically we've been afraid of it. It was considered a toxic element rather than a beneficial element. And we now are learning, and we've understood for a long time, that it is beneficial in very small concentrations for many plants. In fact, it's considered an essential nutrient for pecans. It's the only crop that it's considered an essential for. But we're now understanding that it is beneficial for many other plants as well. But again, the concentrations required are very small. You need something like 10 grams an acre, 5 to 10 grams per acre of nickel on most crops to have an adequate nickel supply. And the historical assumption has just been that most plants, most crops have enough. We know that that's not the case, because anytime plants are not able to metabolize ammonium properly from photorespiration, we find that very frequently nickel deficiencies are uh, a contributing factor there. So how do you test for it? How do you manage it? You have to ask labs to measure it. There's not a lot of labs that make it a routine habit of measuring nickel and reporting it. So you have to work with a tissue analysis lab or work with a lab that can measure nickel levels. And then you also have to have some conversation about what optimal ranges are. Last question from JC. If you are trying to transition into a more regenerative practice before the biology has actually kicked in, actually, I want to pause right there. Biology can kick in really fast given the opportunity to do so. The time period is not measured in months or years, it's measured in weeks. Again, given the right opportunity. It depends on soil context, depends on what you're willing to do from a cover crop perspective and so forth. But if given the right context and the right situation, the I just lost track here. You can actually turn soil biology around and turn it on to have it delivering a lot of nutrients in a matter of weeks to months, not in a matter of years. So the remainder of the question is, what's the right form and timing of calcium in a corn and soybean operation? Oh boy, you ask good questions. The right form depends on soil pH and soil calcium and magnesium balance in general. I'm looking at this from a soil perspective. The two materials that we use a lot of are gypsum and limestone, pelletized, in furrow, or broadcast, depending on, I mean, there's a lot of variables here. And the optimal timing is for those types of thinking about gypsum and pelletized limestone as a calcium fertilizer, you're looking at roughly a 30 to 45 day release curve. And you want, again, depending on some soil conditions, and you want the release curve to occur during bloom and pollination or just before. So that means on a soybean crop, you're looking at roughly planting or just before planting. But on a corn crop, it might actually be valuable to side dress it and put it on post planting. So that's a broad framework for thinking about it. All right, so there are quite a number of questions here that I haven't gotten the chance to get to yet, that have been coming in from online. I apologize for not getting all of those, but please reach out to our team at Advancing Eco Agriculture. I'm very fortunate to work with an amazing team. We're over 80 people at this point, and I'm not the only person that has answers to the questions. We share our knowledge collectively. Our team is able to answer lots of questions that people have very effectively. So please pick up the phone, call us. We're happy to work with you. Our phone number is 800-495-6603. And we're happy to dig in and answer any agronomic questions that you have. This is what we're here for, and this is what we have lots of fun doing. So thank you all for being here. May your growing season be blessed. May the rain always come on time. May the diseases and insects avoid your crops, and may you have an awesome day. Thank you all.